We are
Awesome.
live now.
Okay, fabulous. Thank you for that introduction, Quinn. I'm going to set my little timer here so I don't prattle on incoherently too terribly much. So I'm going to be speaking tonight about Native economy and archaeology tourism. I'm going to kind of take us on a trip to the Southwest and hopefully give everyone a different perspective on how to think about tourism and sustainability. So like any decent guide, I will let you guys know where we're going. So for starters, I'll kind of explain my Peoples, Rivers, and Ruins project. So this is a project I started back in 2018, and this is really just kind of a small piece of what I'm working on in this larger project in the Southwest. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit, and then I'm going to explain a little bit about Navajo Nation. I could talk all night long about Navajo Nation, so I'm just going to focus on some details just to kind of get us oriented. And then we're going to talk a lot about sustainability and what sustainability is and how we can do things sustainably. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about Big Hogan Enterprise. So Big Hogan Enterprise is a Navajo owned and operated bed and breakfast just outside of Grand Canyon. So this really kind of brings together the whole talk. All right, so for starters, I am not a Southwest archaeologist. I say that all the time, and yet I am doing all this work out in the Southwest. So who am I and why am I doing this work in the Southwest? Well, this is a picture of my dad and I, in case you couldn't recognize the family resemblance there. It's like what I would look like with a beard, possibly. So this is my dad, who is actually an Indian art trader. So I grew up spending a lot of time, I lived in Southern California, but I spent a ton of time on the road with my dad on buying trips. So we used to go out to Hopi and Navajo. We would bring vegetables and coal, and we would sit down and chat with folks while we were buying their art. So I actually grew up spending a ton of time on Hopi and Navajo land. So in addition to all that, as I went back to undergrad and finished my master's degree, I actually was at Northern Arizona University, which is in Northern Arizona. And as a part of my training, I basically was a Southwest archaeologist. So I was trained as a Southwest archaeologist. I worked for the National Park Service for 3 years. So I've done a lot of Southwest archaeology. My normal life now is to spend time doing large game hunting. So with bison and looking at isotopes and trying to reconstruct environments and understand how people used landscape. So that's what I tend to do, but I've kind of gone back to my roots lately to do this Southwest work. And this picture here is a picture of a river trip I took. This is the San Juan River. We were out on a 3-day river trip just back in 2018. And this is what really kind of got me thinking about how tourism and archaeological sites and Native people really kind of come together in really important ways. So this entire project was born on the San Juan River on this river trip. And then ruins is what we're going to spend some time talking about. I'm going to come back and talk about River House later, but this is River House. I don't know if you can see my cursor up here is actually a little bit of rock art that looks something like a river. And more importantly, the San Juan River is just right over here. So River House is one of thousands of archaeological sites out in this region. And so this kind of brings together my Peoples, Rivers, and Ruins project. So this is Navajo Nation, just to kind of give you an idea of where we're at. So I'm going to be talking a lot about Navajo land, which is Navajo Nation here, this evening, but there are actually quite a few other Native American groups in this area. You can see the Hopi Reservation is right smack dab in the middle of Navajo. That is their ancestral lands, and Navajo also have their ancestral lands. So you can kind of see how Navajo surrounds Hopi. And then there's also Zuni and the Ute, and there are actually some other tribes in there as well, like the Wallapai out kind of in the Grand Canyon area, but we're going to focus mostly on Navajo Nation this evening. So Navajoland, or Diné Bikéyah, is covers 27,000 acres, so not a small piece of real estate. It's got a population of over 250,000 people. So we're talking about a huge area and lots of folks. If you've heard anything about Navajo lately, you've probably heard that they're getting walloped by COVID. So this is definitely a big thing that is happening in kind of the current media. They've been hit really hard out there, as have a lot of indigenous groups. And maybe you've heard about Bears Ears. So the conflict of the Bears Ears National Monument has really put Navajo on the map in a much broader scope than it was prior to the last 4 years or so. So I'm not going to talk a whole lot about Bears Ears this evening, but I do want you to see where it is. So this is Bears Ears National Monument, this big green spot. That San Juan River I was talking about, you can see right here, that runs just on the northern edge of Navajo. And then you can see the Ute Mountains and Zuni. There's Albuquerque, Flagstaff, Salt Lake City, and Aspen, just so you kind of get the idea of where you're at here in the Four Corners area. So the reason that I bring up Bears Ears at all is because I want you to kind of see where this is in relation to Navajo Nation. So it's just to the north. And when I talk about that river house, that's actually just inside the Bears Ears National Monument. So what really matters about this that I want to kind of bring up, and why I bring up Bears Ears at all this evening, is that this area by itself has thousands of archaeological sites, thousands. So this site, this whole area, when the Obama administration went ahead and preserved it as a one kind of like national reserve area. They worked with Native Americans. This was huge. And 1.35 million acres is a ton of space. Now, there's a ton of archaeology that's been out there for thousands of years, right? The thing is, nobody really knew about it until this area was made this national monument and then subsequently shrunk by the Trump administration. And wherever you sit on the politics of that, what happened was an explosion of media, which meant an explosion of tourism. And an explosion of tourism to archaeological sites that aren't protected. So that has actually caused some serious concerns for Navajo folks, but also for people that are just concerned generally about the archaeology in the area. Because now all of a sudden you have all of these archaeological sites and they're not protected, and there's a lot more tourism than there's ever been before. So we're gonna get to that, talk more about that later, but keep that in mind as we kind of move through this talk. So what is sustainability? When you think of sustainability, I'm willing to bet, like if you're going to challenge your mind sustainably and you're going to think about this water bottle, this is probably the first thing that pops into your head, right? Reduce, reuse, recycle. I'm going to drink my water out of that bottle. And if I'm really eco-conscious, I might remember to take the lid off and throw it away before I go and recycle it, right? We tend to think of sustainability in these really simple terms. And the reality is that sustainability is a little bit more complicated. The actual definition behind sustainability is living for today without compromising the lives of tomorrow. When we think about sustainability, we're actually looking for this kind of intersection here in the middle where we say sustainable. So we've got our entire ecosystem, but then we've got ourselves, our economies, our social lives, our culture, and the planet itself. And we can't just protect one thing. It doesn't work. So if you envision like coal miners, and we know that burning coal is bad for the environment. So if we just say, we're gonna stop burning coal, we're not gonna burn coal anymore. Great, that's wonderful ecologically, but what about all those people that make a living as coal miners? If you're not leaving them in a situation that is equitable socially and economically, then they're not going to be on board with making this sustainable move. They need to be trained. right? They need to actually have a benefit for this major shift in their production of energy. And then we still have to have some kind of energy to replace coal once it's gone. So sustainability is more complicated. So we're going to think about sustainability this way instead of our reduce, reuse cycle. So this actually comes from the UN. And this is their Sustainable Development Goals. I'm just going to read them to you really, really quickly, just so you kind of know what we're really shooting for here. So we want no poverty, yes, globally. We want people to not be hungry. We want good health and well-being, yes, for everyone. And we want everyone to have quality education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation. And all of these things are geared towards being culturally appropriate in their cultures, not necessarily taking our idea of clean water and sanitation and applying it into a different culture, but making sure that we are being culturally appropriate wherever we're working. We want affordable and clean energy and decent work with the chance for economic growth. We want industry, innovation, and infrastructure, right? We want dams that actually work, that don't break and like drown out communities. We want to reduce inequality, and we want to have sustainable cities and communities. And we want to be responsible with our consumption and production. And we want to think about climate action in big terms. We don't want farmers who have massive droughts in Africa paying for the carbon emissions that we're producing in China and the US, right? We want to think about our climate action in this global scale. And we want to think about life below the water and on land. And we want peace, justice, and strong institutions. And above all, we want partnership for all of these goals coming together. So this is what sustainability actually is. It's kind of a mess, right? It's a little bit complicated, and it's way more complicated than just recycling that bottle of water. So what I'm going to talk to you guys about tonight is how can we keep all of these things in mind and kind of in our back pocket as tourists. And when the world opens back up, when we can travel to the Southwest, I hope that you can kind of think of these things. But even now, while we're kind of stuck at home and in this digital world, there's a lot of things that you can do that support Native communities just by keeping these kind of goals in the back of your mind. So let's talk about tourism. We can all fantasize about the after times when we actually get to be out in the world again. We have these three pillars of sustainable tourism that we really want to shoot for. So we want environmentally friendly practices while traveling. We want to protect our cultural and natural heritage. I'm going to talk about that more in a bit. And then we want to provide tangible social and economic benefits for local communities. So I'm going to break these down and kind of take each one at a time. So when we think of Southwest tourism, we're thinking of like going out and visiting like Grand Canyon area, right? So what are we doing in Grand Canyon? Well, there's two sides to Grand Canyon. So there's the national park side that tends to be pretty ecologically driven. And then there's the Western Rim. I don't know if you guys have heard of like, you know, you can go and you can walk out on that feat of engineering and like see all the way down underneath your feet. It's terrifying. I don't trust an engineer enough to actually stand on that thing, but you can go do it. So there's the West Rim and there's the South Rim. And then there's the North Rim, which is also owned by the national parks. So if you want to go on a helicopter ride, I would strongly suggest going to the West Rim. One of the problems is that this creates a lot of noise pollution, and that can be kind of annoying for people that are visiting, but it can be actually really detrimental to the landscape and the animals because they don't want to hear it either. So they're very dispersed and kind of far away from the touristed areas out at the West Rim. Interestingly enough, the West Rim is actually owned and operated, well, it's owned, the land is owned by the tribes. But the people that run the hotels and the helicopter companies and all of these other things actually aren't locals. They're from very far away. And that's something I want you guys to kind of keep in mind when we're talking about Southwest tourism, is that most of the places you go, when you stay at a resort or you stay at a hotel, you're actually not putting money back into the community because those resorts and those hotels are owned by people in Manhattan or LA, and often in places like Japan and China. These people aren't actually locals. And if you really want to support a local economy, you've got to kind of think about who owns the places that you're staying. The other problem is that they don't have a lot of investment in things like water supply. When the water runs out, they'll just shut down their hotels and open them somewhere else, right? That doesn't impact the local community because they're not really thinking about it. They don't really care. So there's less reason to be good stewards of the land if it's not your home. So that's something that I want you to kind of have in mind as we talk about how to travel sustainably. So if we're talking about that pillar 1, that environmentally friendly practices while traveling, we want to reduce, reuse, recycle, but we really want to focus on the reduce and reuse more so than the recycle. So big things that you can do to kind of lower your ecological footprint by traveling is to avoid air travel entirely, which, lately is like probably a good idea anyway. But after the world opens back up, you could not fly. If you absolutely have to fly, it is very difficult to walk or drive to, say, France. If you have to drive or if you have to fly, you can actually use this carbon offsetting. So what's carbon offsetting? There's this site called cooleffects.org. There's actually tons of them. They'll actually calculate how much carbon you're putting into the system by taking your flight. And then you pay a little bit of money and they're going to help folks in Africa or they're going to help folks in South America plant enough trees to offset your carbon footprint. It's not ideal, but it is a way for wealthier countries to kind of at least get to a net zero of their carbon footprint. So that's a big thing that we can do. I want you to think about like littler things that we can do. So I have 2 spoons here. I have a plastic spoon. I have a regular spoon. And if you're thinking about like, oh, quick, lazy, I'm hungry, and I'm just gonna eat my lunch real quick, and then I'm gonna run off because I'm touring, which one's easier? The plastic spoon? Probably. Most of us think of the plastic spoon as being the easiest possible thing, right? We're just gonna use it, we're gonna pitch it, we're not even gonna recycle it, which is fine because it's not recyclable anyway, right? But we have this thing that we've just pitched. Well, it's pretty amazing that our society has reached a point where the effort necessary to extract oil from the ground, ship it to a refinery, turn it into plastic, shape it appropriately, truck it to a store, buy it and bring it home is considered to be less effort than what it takes to just wash the spoon when you're done with it. Right? This is our culture. So plastics have been in production for really only about 6 decades. And in that time, we've created 8.3 billion metric tons of plastic. Only about 9% of that is recycled globally. So what do we do? I mean, there's like literally plastic bits that are raining and snowing down on the highest peaks of mountains. Like we have a serious plastic problem. So when it comes to traveling, this is something you can think about at home when you're ordering that takeout or when you're picking up food for, our COVID can't be safe in a restaurant sort of thing. Tell them you don't need the plasticware, right? Tell them you've got silverware at home. What can you do when you're traveling? Go to these smaller places. So this is a place I stayed at in Bluff. It's a really tiny little hotel, really nice, not any more expensive than the bigger hotels and resorts in the area. And look at this picture real quick. There's nothing here that is going to go into the dump, right? Wash the damn spoon. It seems like a simple thing, but think about it like the next time we go to meetings like this, when you can be out in public again, bring your own cup. You don't have to use the styrofoam cup or the paper cup that is sitting at that hall when you go get your coffee, right? And that seems weird, like, ooh, bring my own stuff. That's strange. Why would I do that? Because it's better. It's better for the environment. So be demanding of those kinds of things, even when you're traveling. Make sure that you're staying at places that are doing the right thing. And then we want to protect our cultural and natural heritage. So we don't think about archaeological sites as being the non-renewable resource that they are. So if you think of like coal or oil or any of the other things that are non-renewable resources or endangered species, those are really kind of clear ideas, I think, in the public's head. But what people don't realize is that every single archaeological site is unique. there's only one of it. And if it gets destroyed, that's it. It's gone forever. And a piece of history dies with it, and a piece of prehistory dies with it. And we'll never be able to get that story back once it's destroyed. So protecting archaeological sites is super important when we're traveling, especially when we're traveling to places because of the archaeology, because we want to check out the past that is in these places. So we tend to love prehistory to death, and I might be a little bit of an optimist, but I don't think that people are inherently evil, and I don't think that people go out determined to destroy things on purpose. I think people have no idea what they're looking at, and they've never really thought about the fact that this is the only river house in the entire world. And the people that lived here, however many hundreds or thousands of years ago, only lived here for a short period of time. And everything that has ever been documented about their lives is in this little tiny structure. And that's it. Once we destroy it, it's gone for good. So when people come along and they check out River House and they pick up a piece of corn and they take it back to Manhattan and they take it back to California, that's gone from the site forever. We can never put it back in context, and we can never figure out exactly where the people that left it behind left it. It's gone forever. We call that provenience. As archaeologists, we care more about where stuff is sitting than what it actually is. So places like River House have gotten beat up pretty badly because they are so accessible from the river. Lots of stuff gets stolen, so there's less and less pottery sherds every year. It's kind of getting loved to death. And I think that's because most people just get excited, right? You like see this little adventurous place and you've just taken 2 days to get there by river, and now you've gotten to hike up to it and it's awesome and you want to take a souvenir home, which is a horrible idea, right? Don't take things home with you. It is illegal. But we're going to talk about some guidelines on how you can visit these types of places safely. But this kind of damage to archaeological sites is happening all over because of what I was explaining about all of this tourism that's happening at Bears Ears. What you see here is a rock art panel, that really clean line that you see in it. Somebody took a saw to it. They actually jackhammered a fair amount of it off and took it away with them. And who knows where that is now. And even if they felt guilty and years later sent it back, which happens all the time, Chaco Canyon has boxes and boxes and boxes of pottery sherds that people have gathered up and felt bad about later. And the problem is that they're basically meaningless by the time they come back because the provenience is gone. It came from Chaco is not enough information to tell us anything about the people. So this rock art panel has unfortunately been destroyed. You can see these ATV tracks. Vehicles are hard on landscapes, and a lot of times people don't know that they're even driving over an archaeological site. So a lot of damage can happen just from people being out exploring and then wanting to take a piece of prehistory home. So the good thing about the Bears Ears kind of explosion of attention is that not only are people out there and they're excited, but a lot of money got flooded into the area. And so Patagonia dumped a ton of money into both their legal battles to get that land back, but also into public education, because people just need to be told, I think on the whole, people just need to be told that the archaeology is important and it's fragile, and they just don't think about it unless you explain it to them. So these guys will actually give you a map that tells you how to get to archaeological sites that are easily accessible and that they know are going to be mildly damaged no matter what. They've already got a lot of, we kind of call them like sacrificial sites. We don't want people to hurt them, but we know that they're going to get visited a lot, whether or not we provide them with a map. So by providing them with a map, it protects the harder to get to sites, and it also gives them some instruction on how do you visit these archaeological sites safely for the artifacts. So I'm going to run through this with you really quickly, just when you're thinking about visiting archaeological sites. This is actually from the Bears Ears page. Leave all artifacts. Leave all artifacts where you find them so the next person can share the experience. It is also actually illegal to move or take any artifacts from public lands. Don't touch the rock art, leave it alone. People do these rubbings of rock art because they want to take a picture home, which is, it's a little better than like chipping it off the wall, but actually not a lot. It hurts the rock art. Leave the rock art alone, take a picture, walk away. Vandalizing rock art erases stories of ancient people, and it destroys the experience for future visitors. Enjoy it with your eyes, and possibly a camera. Historic and prehistoric structures can be easily damaged. Please refrain from touching, leaning, standing, or climbing on the structures. I was actually reconstructing a wall in Wapaki as part of my job, and I fell off the blasted thing and screwed up my ankle. So they're not stable, so it's not good to climb on them anyway. It's also bad for the archaeology. Guide children through sites and just inform them. Don't let them tear things up or throw rocks or do bad things to the site. Archaeological sites are not playgrounds. I might disagree with that actually, but we'll let that go. Please teach children respect. Keep an eye on your kids so they don't get hurt and so they don't hurt the site. It's good to bring dogs out into the wilderness, and it's really good to keep them out of archaeological sites. They dig and they leave messes, and it's just better to keep them out. And people love to build cairns, and I don't know why this is a human thing, but it is a cute human thing. Hiking trails all over the place. God, we love to build little piles of rocks that say, I was here. Honestly, this is probably the least damaging thing that you can do, but what people often do is they pick up artifacts to make their cairns with because they don't recognize them as artifacts, or they like pull apart a wall to make their cairn. So we don't want to add anything, we don't want to take anything away. So that's kind of the like leave no trace principles that we want to travel with when we're traveling to the Southwest. I lost my ability to make my thing go to the next slide. There we go. Okay. All right. So if we're talking about pillars of sustainable tourism, this is kind of like the last thing I want to talk about before I get into Bears Ears is how do you provide tangible, sociable, and economical benefits for those local communities? And in this case, we're talking about Indigenous folks. These are the lands of their ancestors. They were removed onto reservations, but these are their homelands. These are their home territories. The archaeology in this area links directly to the living populations that are there today. So if you're going to go out and see these archaeological sites, you should probably care about the basic Indigenous rights of the people. We want to make sure that they get fair wages. Supporting a business that is sending a ton of money out to Japan, which is a lot of the resorts out in the Grand Canyon area, doesn't do anything to support the Indigenous community. So we got to think through how can we be supporting the communities of origin and the communities that really deeply care about the archaeology. They care about the ecosystem, they care about the environment because it's home. So when we're traveling out in the Southwest, we really want to make sure that we are giving these people as much support as we possibly can. So how do you do that? So I'm going to tell you a little story about a woman named Alberta Henry and Big Hogan Enterprises. So Alberta Henry, I took that river trip, and my dad, who lives out on Navajo, actually, he still works as an Indian trader, but he does work at Cameron Trading Post, which is not owned by Indigenous folks, but it employs many, many, many of them. So my dad lives out there, and he says, oh, you've got to stay at Big Hogan. And I'm going, I don't know anyone that has a Hogan out here that I would stay at. And I was really confused. And he was like, no, it's like a bed and breakfast. And I went, you mean like a bed and breakfast that is owned and operated by Navajo people on Navajo land? That sounds perfect, right? Because we're putting that money back into the community. On top of that, Big Hogan Enterprises is just adjacent to Grand Canyon. So if you look over here, this is where they are. She is like on the very edge of Navajo land. What's cool about Alberta and her family is that her family's actually lived out on this land for 4 generations now. So she has this deep history of this deep family tie to this landscape. And on top of that, Navajo folks don't mess around with artifacts because it's bad luck. In Navajo culture, so we tend to be collectors. Western folks tend to pick things up, put it in their pocket. It's just something we do. It's not good, but we do it, and it's kind of a cultural thing. Navajo folks don't do that because that actually belongs to someone else. And it is deep in their culture that it's bad luck to touch it. It's bad luck to mess with it. It belongs to someone else, and it is busily becoming part of the landscape again. So they don't touch stuff, which means there's a ton more archaeology on Navajo land than there are basically anywhere else out there. So I'm going to get to that in a moment. But this is basically ideal because you're right next to Grand Canyon, which is amazing. And of course, everybody who goes out to the Southwest wants to see Grand Canyon, even if you do the tourist thing where you stand in front of it for 15 minutes and that's all the more time you spend there. At least you've spent your 15 minutes at Grand Canyon. That's good. If you want to be more adventurous than that, you can actually spend a couple days going in and hiking and seeing a ton of archaeology. There's museums. And there's archaeology from the rim all the way down. So their backcountry sites are very difficult to get to, thank goodness, because it keeps them safe. And then there are sites right up on the rim that have like museum tours that you can walk through. So there's a ton to do out at Grand Canyon. And when we talked about the first pillar of sustainable travel, this is completely off grid. So there's no electricity. There's a few solar panels. There's some solar lights to be able to like plug in your phone and that kind of thing. But other than that, it's totally off grid. The toilets are compostable toilets. They're composting toilets, and the showers are solar showers. So if it's really cold, and I've been out there a couple times, so it's a little chilly, she's actually trucked out hot water so I could take a warm shower, which was very nice of her. But a lot of times her little solar heaters on the shower make for pretty good warm water, especially when you're out there during the summer. So totally off grid, so your footprint is very, very low. She also has amazing food, and she tells wonderful stories about her family. She'll take you out to see the old hogans that her grandpa built when he was first living out there, and she'll tell you all kinds of stories directly from the mouth of a Navajo person, instead of hearing kind of a watered down version of it from other folks. So you get a really unique experience that is a totally rich experience that you can't possibly have anywhere else. So am I plugging for Big Hogan? Yes, absolutely. But for good reason, right? It's also cheaper than any of the hotels around. And it's a much shorter drive to Grand Canyon than anywhere else around too. So there's archaeology, like I said, all over her site. Now, as an archaeologist, what we have to do, so I told you every archaeological site is unique and it's special. And that means if you're trying to grow something like a business and you're trying to put in things like more hogans, you have to make sure the archaeology is cleared. And so that's a requirement everywhere. That's a requirement for expanding a road, and that's a requirement for building your Big Hogan business. So she had her one little hogan that she had permission to build, and she had her one little pit toilet, and she was like ready to build more, but she couldn't get the archaeological survey done to be able to clear the rest of the land so she could build her business. And archaeological surveys by professional CRM companies are spendy. They can be like $6,000. So when I was out visiting with her, I said, well, how much land do you have out here? And she's like, oh, about 50 acres. And I said, hell, Alberta, I'll come back with students and I'll just knock this out for you. So in March 2020, all of these lovely Augustana students came out. Isn't it weird to see people without masks like close to each other? It's almost anxiety inducing. So this was before the pandemic really exploded. Actually, the pandemic really exploded while we were out there. We were completely locked down and isolated amongst ourselves. And thankfully, none of us had COVID, so we didn't bring it there. And no one there had COVID, so we didn't bring it home. They did unfortunately get nailed with COVID right after we left, but we dodged a bullet there. So what we're doing here is actually lining out to go and recognize all of the archaeological sites so that she knows what she has on her land. And I say her land, Navajo's a little different than our ideas of land ownership. So she's basically leasing the land, and her family lease has gone on for generations. So the land is actually not hers. She's just borrowing it from Navajo. You actually can't own property on Navajo, so it's a very different land ownership system. So we wanted to make sure she knew what archaeology she had, but we also wanted to make sure that she knew where the big sites were so she wouldn't accidentally build right on top of it. So we went out and spent spring break we got a signal, a cell phone signal up on the top of this hill. So it was like we'd come over the ridge and we would line up just like this, and we'd put a pin flag in every place that we found archaeology. And then we'd go back and we'd record the site. So we would come up over this hill, and then we would hear about how the university is being shut down and how all of the classes are going online, and how my daughter's parade that she was supposed to play snare in has been canceled. And, you know, all these little things were happening in the background of the survey that we were carrying out. The university asked me to recall my students and come home a couple days early, and I sent them a letter back saying, no, thank you, we're fine here. And that all worked out okay, because none of us got sick. This just kind of gives you a little bit of a view of, so that's the inside of that rock art panel is right up here. And if you can see these grinding slicks right here, there's quite a few of those. This is all archaic, so about 2,000 to 4,000 year old rock art. We've got pictures of like deer and those kinds of things. And then we've got pottery, which comes about much later. So we actually have like almost consistent occupation from 4,000 years ago all the way up to present. And we've got historical sites there as well that are Alberta's family. She actually has oral family traditions and history that trace some of the early Navajo sites that are on her land. So she has a tremendous amount of archaeology. And when we finish up writing the report, we're going to give her a pamphlet that she can give to her visitors so that they can understand. And we're also going to include the, like, here's how to treat archaeology kindly and how to not damage it while you're visiting. So she'll have a little pamphlet that can explain all of the archaeology on her property and also be able to keep things safe while she has her visitors. So really, this is about the best possible kind of accumulation of sustainable tourism in the Southwest that I can possibly imagine. And I hope that we see more businesses like this come about so that we can promote and kind of help out our Indigenous populations when we travel. So I hope that your take homes from this project are like, wow, I can't wait till the world opens up so I can go to Grand Canyon and stay at Big Hogan. But I also hope that you'll think about things more sustainably in the broader sense of sustainability. I hope that you'll spend some time thinking about maybe washing the spoon instead of using plastics and those single-use plastics, and maybe think a little bit about promoting Indigenous art and Indigenous crafts. So when you buy Native American made things, you're actually promoting them being able to teach their kids how to make those crafts, how to tell their stories, what matters in their culture. It's totally fine to wear Native American made things, but they need to be from Native American people. Because if we refuse to wear their art because we're worried about appropriating their culture in toxic ways, then they have to go be an electrician and they can't stay on the res. And you saw how big that res is. If you have to move off the res to get a job, you're moving away from your culture, your family, your history, your traditions, your archaeology, your everything. If you can make a living making your own crafts on the res, that's actually better. And then you can do it with your children and your families. So promoting businesses from your home or when you actually travel is what I hope that you guys kind of took away from this talk. So these are some of her tents. If you are out there, she now has 2 more big hogans, and these tents are lovely. She also has propane heaters for in the winter. So they will hopefully be open in February. And thank you guys for your time and attention. I'm happy to spend the last bit of time with you, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I really learned a lot, especially about, I had no idea the Navajo, their beliefs with artifacts and not picking them up. That's very interesting.
Yeah, it's cool. When I'll tell you a quick story and then we can do questions or whatever. When we were on that river trip, so where there's the Navajo side of the river and the other side of the river, if you notice. And so we had a Navajo guide, so we were actually able to go on Navajo. It's like on the BLM side, all the artifacts are just stripped. And you go over to the Navajo side and it's like you can't walk without stepping on sherds and, you know, lithics and just corn and stuff is just everywhere. So it really shows the difference of that like cultural pattern of collecting.
Definitely, and the arid environment things preserve a lot better out there than they do kind of out
Yes.
here.
Yes.
Yeah,
Totally. One winner on here.
definitely. So we'll open it up for questions. You can unmute yourself, or if you want to, write in the chat box. Or if you have issues with doing that, you can message me too. Anyone have any questions? Okay, while people are thinking, I have a question.
Yeah,
So
shoot.
when you were down there, with the Navajo, and it definitely depends on the person and their opinion, but what was the general consensus of tourism to the area? Was it positive, or was it more, varied when, we tourists would come?
No, I'm so glad you asked that, because actually it's been really, really positive. And in kind of another section of this talk, and I stripped it for time, I went through Bluff and took pictures of the old buildings versus the new buildings. And there's this old river house, they've had this just old rundown garage for years. And now the new river house is the new structure that they're running their river trips out of, is gorgeous. I mean, it's beautiful. And so that's great for the River Guide Company, which does employ a ton of Indigenous folks. They make a point of having half or more of their population actually being Indigenous. So that really helps them. But in addition to that, all the money that all this Bears Ears tourism and everything else has brought into Bluff, they're rebuilding the elementary school and they're putting in a clinic. So there's a ton of resources that are actually coming into the area because of this uptick in tourism. So their big concern is, like, how do we do this constructively? Because there's no doubt that economically it's a huge win. To have that additional tourism really brings them money. They can make those crafts and sell them. And that's just huge for them. So all of that has been a huge win. It's just, how do we keep the archaeology safe, and how do we keep the natural resources safe while these people come out and enjoy our lands? And every Navajo person I've talked to out there really talks about sharing their home they're with other people, which they're more than happy to do as long as people are respectful.
That's great to hear. Anyone else have any questions? Comments? Okay, last chance. All right, I guess we'll go ahead and end it. I really appreciate you taking your time putting this presentation together and giving this for us.
Not a problem. Thanks for the invite. It's we were chatting earlier, but being able to do all this on Zoom is kind of nice. I didn't have to worry about like driving home in the slush and ice. I can like go walk into my kitchen now and have dinner instead.
That's awesome. Definitely convenient.
Awesome. So thank you so much for the
Thank
invite.
you.
Last chance. Anybody else have questions?
Not seeing anything in the chat. Everyone's very quiet. All right, everyone. We'll close this out, and then, yes, we'll have this recording saved.